Came to Sheerness to film a boat, and this is what happened. So I'm going to treat this more as a kind of a location scouting mission, and then maybe come back tomorrow. Did I come to Sheerness for the lovely seafront, beautiful town, the glorious weather? 10 seconds ago it was shitting it down with rain, now it's beautiful sunshine. Yes, I came here for all of those things, but I also came here because it's about to blow up.
Okay, so maybe it's not going to explode right now, but one day it might.
About a mile offshore behind me over there, where there's a boat kind of handily parked right in front of it, is a ticking time bomb. Over there is the wreck of the SS Richard Montgomery, which has been there since 1944, when it sunk whilst carrying a metric ton of munitions for the Allied forces.
So a little bit of background on the Montgomery. She was built in 1943 in Florida and named after an Irish officer, Richard Montgomery, who fought in the American Revolutionary War, still seemingly haunting the British many tens of decades even after he died, and was part of the Liberty Ship program, which were kind of America's wartime workhorses, who were built to transport weapons, really pump them across the Atlantic to help with the Allied efforts. You know, they were kind of mass-produced floating death machines. They weren't exactly doing the killing themselves, but they were bringing everything required for other people to do the killing. And in August 1944, she left from Hog Island in Philadelphia and travelled from the Delaware River all the way to the Thames estuary. And on this particular trip, she happened to be carrying around 7,000 tons of munitions. Or if you want to be more specific, 6,127 tons. Her ultimate destination was Cherbourg in France, because at that point, France had come back under Allied control, thanks to the Battle of Normandy, but she had to go through various local authorities and await the convoy that she was going to join up with. So, in the meantime, she came under the authority of the Thames Naval Control at HMS Lee.
On the 20th of August 1944, the Montgomery arrived off the coast of Kent. When she arrived, she was directed to anchor off Sheerness in a spot that was supposed to be deep enough for a vessel of her size.
But here's where things went wrong. When she dragged anchor on the Great Nore anchorage, the tide was far lower than expected, and she almost immediately ran aground on a sandbank. Now you might wonder how nobody noticed this was going to happen. Surely this was a really obvious mistake. And it seems like some people had noticed, because during the inquiry it was found out that a lot of ships that were anchored nearby and were perhaps a little more familiar with the area and, where the sandbanks were, had seen the Montgomery drifting towards this sandbank. And a lot of them had actually sounded their sirens to try and alert the Montgomery as to what was about to happen. But it was discovered that the ship's chief officer had done nothing. The Captain Wilkie, had been asleep, and the ship's officer hadn't woken him up either. And the chief officer, ultimately the inquiry, was not able to give a valid answer as to why he hadn't taken any action to respond to these sirens. But the Board of Inquiry eventually concluded that it wasn't the captain or the chief officer's fault, and it was in fact the harbour master having assigned them to an inappropriate anchorage that had placed the ship in jeopardy.
The ship began to list, and salvage crews were rushed in immediately to start trying to retrieve all the cargo that was aboard, but they didn't have very long to do it. 4 days later, on the 24th of August, the hull cracked and the ship split in two. At that point, the ship went down. Now, the salvage crews had only managed to remove about half of her cargo, but that still left about 1,400 tons of explosives and munitions on board her, and those ended up in the same place she did, at the bottom of the estuary.
Now, interestingly, the wreck is in such shallow water that it's never actually fully submerged by the tide, and those three masts are always visible. And in fact, on some occasions, the tide has been so low that more of the ship has been revealed, looking like some kind of ominous, ever-present skeleton out there in the estuary. The ship is constantly monitored by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and there's an exclusion zone around her that is constantly monitored visually and by radar. And super annoyingly, because I had wonderful plans to very carefully fly the drone over to it and get some really cool shots, but I'm recording this in June 2025, and as of May 2025, they have placed a rather large flight restriction around the wreck as well, which, yes, even includes tiny unmanned drones. So unfortunately, no drone shots today. Just some shots that are about as close as my telephoto lens could reach.
Is she going to explode? Probably not, but you can never really be sure, because that's been down there for, 80 years at this point. So all it would take would be one small shift in the sand, a rogue anchor, something disturbing that wreck could set it off. And that would start a chain reaction, and every single one of those munitions that are still on board would go off.
So what's still down there? Inside the wreck, there still lies an estimated 1,400 tons of munitions. And we've got a wonderful little breakdown from a survey conducted in 2000 by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency about specifically what is still down there. We have 286 2,000-pound high explosive bombs, 4,439 1,000-pound bombs of various types, 1,925 500-pound bombs, 2,815 fragmentation bombs and bomb clusters, various explosive booster charges, various smoke bombs, including some wonderful white phosphorus bombs, and various pyrotechnic signals. So basically just a whole bunch of fun stuff, if it wasn't sitting just underwater off the coast of a very populated area.
One report from 1970 actually estimated that if those explosives were to go off, they could explode with the force of a small nuclear bomb.
It would launch a 300-meter wide column of water and debris nearly 3,000 meters into the air. And not just that, it would generate a tidal wave 5 meters high. The damage they predicted would be that almost every window in Sheerness would be shattered. Buildings would be massively damaged. They were pretty worried about this in the 1970s. Newer reports in May 2012 were a little less dramatic, predicting that the tidal wave would only be about 1 meter high, but would still be significant enough to cause serious flooding in some of those coastal areas.
And in 2004, another report established that the worst case scenario would involve not just extensive damage to Sheerness and the local area here, but actually to the oil and gas refineries that are just round the corner on the other side of the Medway estuary. And obviously that would have severe implications for the local environment and local ecosystems, and just generally be a pretty bad thing. But hey, don't worry, it's got a circle of boys around it, so I'm sure we'll be fine. And everyone here has just kind of learnt to live with it. It's kind of become part of like the local folklore. It actually kind of reminds me of Megaton, the first town that you find in Fallout 3 when you come out of the vault, which has a nuclear bomb just sitting right in the middle of it. And everybody just carries on. But in Fallout 3, this is a spoiler alert for like a 20-year-old game here, but you end up having to make a choice whether to set that bomb off or not. So hopefully there are no post-apocalyptic role-playing style scenarios playing out in Sheerness as we speak, and someone isn't sitting there with their hand on the trigger ready to set this thing off. Because I don't know about you, but I'd rather not be here when it happens. Honestly, I know there's like buoys and stuff around it now, but I'm kind of impressed that it's been there for 80 years, since 1944, and no one's just accidentally bumped into it. Now you might wonder why no one at any point has just decided to remove it, but it seems to be the general consensus, and this is, every single government since 1944 has had a look at it and gone, yes, safe enough, it's stable enough, we don't want to mess with that, and so it's just been sitting there for 80 years. Add to that the fact that obviously messing around with it at all is probably the most likely thing that's going to set it off. And there is precedent for that.
And that precedent was set by a very similar situation in July 1967, which involved a Polish cargo ship called the Kielce. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. This was a cargo ship that sank in 1946 off of Folkestone in the English Channel. A similar operation that would have been performed on the Montgomery was underway on the Kielce to remove munitions. And during that operation, the Kielce exploded with a force equivalent to an earthquake measuring 4.5 on the Richter scale, and leaving a 20-foot deep crater in the seabed. Fortunately, there were no injuries or deaths, but it did bring about a fair amount of panic and chaos. And let's also put this into a little bit of perspective. The Kielce was about 3 or 4 miles from land, which also meant she was in much deeper water than the Richard Montgomery. And she was carrying nowhere near the same amount of explosives that the Montgomery was. And in the many other reports and investigations we've had since then, there's been a lot of to and froing about whether the wreck needs to be completely removed. There have been points where they've come close to actually removing it. There was talk about an airport in the Thames estuary, but there was a lot of concern about the wreck interfering too much with that. And then around 2020, the furthest anyone has got to doing anything with it was a plan to remove the ship's 3 masts was put in place, because there was worry about the masts putting undue strain on the structure of the ship below the water. And obviously a mast breaking off and hitting the ship underneath would probably be bad news for everyone. As of now, June 2025, that still hasn't happened. All we do know is that despite the people who are reassuring us and saying that the ship isn't degrading that much and there's no problem of imminent explosion, we do know that it is just sitting there, degrading more and more as each year goes by. And sure, maybe it's not at risk of exploding today, or next week, or next month, or next year, but at some point, if nobody does anything, the Montgomery is going to go up. And it might just be me, but I think there might be a certain amount of, well, it's been there for 80 years and it hasn't exploded yet, and besides, it would cost a lot of money to remove. I think there's a little bit of that getting in the way of anyone actually doing anything about it. And when the Montgomery eventually does go up, because I think it's a case of when, not if, unless somebody does something about it, then I think there'll be a series of governments asking for forgiveness, who never pulled their finger out to actually make something happen. So, there it sits, just an almost 100-year-old ship full of explosives, quietly stewing away in salt water. Another constant reminder of over-hasty wartime urgency, a lot of bureaucratic missteps, and a slightly uncomfortable reminder that these huge conflicts we get ourselves into tend to have a way of poking their heads up above the water and reminding us they're still there. And I think the SS Richard Montgomery will be there, continually reminding us of its presence for decades to come, until the day it goes bang.
So I wouldn't say it's necessarily completely worth coming here just to see this ship, because that's really as good as you're going to see. If a big boat isn't just parked in front of it, then you're just going to see 3 tiny masts off in the distance. Or you could use some of the handy telescopes that they've provided down the coastline. But if you just want to come and see Sheerness, then go for it. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed today's video, then like and subscribe. That all really helps me out. Also, I now have memberships available, so if you want to buy me a coffee every month, then feel free to sign up for that. You get lots of extra little goodies with that as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.